support him, while the entire camp, roused to interest in the proceedings, stood looking on. Rob cared little for the quarrel between the Turks and Tatars, and under ordinary circumstances would have refused to side with one or the other. But he knew he could not hope to recover his electrical machines unless the city was taken by the band of warriors who had befriended him, so he determined to force an entrance for them. Without hesitation he walked close to the great gate and shattered its fastenings with the force of the electric current directed upon them from the tube. Then, shouting to his friends the Tatars for assistance, they rushed in a body upon the gate and dashed it open. The Turks had expected trouble when they heard the fastenings of the huge gate splinter and fall apart, so they had assembled in force before the opening. As the Tatars poured through the gateway in a compact mass they were met by a hail of bullets, spears and arrows, which did fearful execution among them. Many were killed outright, while others fell wounded, to be trampled upon by those who pressed on from the rear. Rob maintained his position at the front rank, but escaped all injury through the possession of the Garment of Repulsion. But he took an active part in the fight, and pressed the button of the electric tube again and again, tumbling the enemy into heaps on every side, even the horses and camels falling helplessly before the resistless current of electricity. The Tatars shouted joyfully as they witnessed this marvelous feat, and rushed forward to assist in the slaughter, but the boy motioned them all back. He did not wish any more bloodshed than was necessary, and knew that the heaps of unconscious Turks around him would soon recover. So he stood alone and faced the enemy, calmly knocking them over as fast as they came near. Two of the Turks managed to creep up behind the boy, and one of them, who wielded an immense scimitar with a two-edged blade as sharp as a razor, swung the weapon fiercely to cut off Rob's head. But the repulsive force aroused in the garment was so terrific that it sent the weapon flying backwards with redoubled swiftness, so that it caught the second Turk at the waist and cut him fairly in two. Thereafter they all avoided coming near the boy, and in a surprisingly short time the Turkish forces were entirely conquered, all having been reduced to unconsciousness, except a few cowards who had run away and hidden in the cellars or garrets of the houses. The Tatars entered the city with shouts of triumph, and the chief was so delighted that he threw his arms around Rob's neck and embraced him warmly. Then began the sack of Yarkand, the fierce Tatars plundering the bazaars and houses, stripping them of everything of value they could find. Rob searched anxiously among the bodies of the unconscious Turks for the two men who had robbed him, but neither could be found. He was more successful later, for in running through the streets he came upon a band of Tatars leading a man with a rope around his neck, whom Rob quickly recognized as one of the thieves he was hunting for. The Tatars willingly allowed him to search the fellow, and in one of his pockets Rob found the record of events. He had now recovered all his property except the traveling machine, the one thing that was absolutely necessary to enable him to escape from this barbarous country. He continued his search persistently, and an hour later found the dead body of the third robber lying in the square of the center of the city. But the traveling machine was not on his person, and for the first time the boy began to give way to despair. In the distance he heard loud shouts and sound of renewed strife, warning him that the Turks were recovering consciousness and engaging the Tatars with great fierceness. The latter had scattered throughout the town, thinking themselves perfectly secure, so that not only were they unprepared to fight, but they became panic-stricken at seeing their foes return, as it seemed, from death to life. Their usual courage forsook them, and they ran, terrified, in every direction, only to be cut down by the revengeful Turkish scimitars. Rob was sitting upon the edge of a marble fountain in the center of the square when a crowd of victorious Turks appeared and quickly surrounded him. The boy paid no attention to their gestures, and the Turks feared to approach him nearly, so they stood a short distance away and fired volleys at him from their rifles and pistols. Rob glared at them scornfully, and seeing they could not injure him, the Turks desisted, but they still surrounded him, and the crowd grew thicker every moment. Women now came creeping from their hiding places and mingled with the ranks of the men, and Rob guessed from their joyous chattering that the Turks had regained the city and driven out or killed the Tatar warriors. He reflected gloomily that this did not affect his own position in any way, since he could not escape from the oasis. Suddenly, on glancing at the crowd, Rob saw something that arrested his attention. A young girl was fastening some article to the wrist of a burly, villainous-looking Turk. The boy saw a glitter that reminded him of the traveling machine, but immediately afterward the man and the girl bent their heads over the fellow's wrist in such a way that Rob could see nothing more. While the couple were apparently examining the strange device, Rob started to his feet and walked toward them. The crowd fell back at his approach, but the man and the girl were so interested that they did not notice him. He was still several paces away when the girl put out her finger and touched the indicator on the dial. To Rob's horror and consternation, the big Turk began to rise slowly into the air, while a howl of fear burst from the crowd. But the boy made a mighty spring and caught the Turk by his foot, clinging to it with desperate tenacity, while they both mounted steadily upward until they were far above the city of the desert. The big Turk screamed pitifully at first, and then actually fainted away from fright. Rob was much frightened on his part, for he knew if his hands slipped from their hold he would fall to his death. Indeed, one hand was slipping already, so he made a frantic clutch and caught firmly hold of the Turk's baggy trousers. Then slowly and carefully he drew himself up and seized the leather belt that encircled the man's waist. This firm grip gave him new confidence, and he began to breathe more freely. He now clung to the body of the Turk with both legs entwined in the way he was accustomed to cling to a tree trunk when he climbed after cherries at home. He had conquered his fear of falling and took time to recover his wits and his strength. They had now reached such a tremendous height that the city looked like a speck on the desert beneath them. Knowing he must act quickly, Rob seized the dangling left arm of the unconscious Turk and raised it until he could reach the dial of the traveling machine. He feared to unclasp the machine just then for two reasons. If it slipped from his grasp, they would both plunge downward to their death, and he was not sure the machine would work at all if in any other position than fastened to the left wrist. Rob determined to take no chances, so he left the machine attached to the Turk and turned the indicator to 0 and then to east, for he did not wish to rejoin either his enemies, the Turks, or his equally undesirable friends, the Tatars. After traveling eastward a few minutes, he lost sight of the city altogether. So, still clinging to the body of the Turk, he again turned the indicator and began to descend. When at last they landed gently upon a rocky eminence of the Kuen Lun Mountains, the boy's strength was almost exhausted, and his limbs ached with the strain of clinging to the Turk's body. His first act was to transfer the traveling machine to his own wrist, and to see that his other electrical devices were safely bestowed in his pockets. Then he sat upon the rock to rest while the Turk recovered consciousness. Presently the fellow moved uneasily, rolled over, and then sat up and stared at his surroundings. Perhaps he thought he had been dreaming, for he rubbed his eyes and looked again, with mingled surprise and alarm. Then, seeing Rob, he uttered a savage shout and drew his dagger. Rob smiled and pointed the electric tube at the man, who doubtless recognized its power, for he fell back, scowling and trembling. "This place seems like a good jog from civilization," remarked the boy, as coolly as if his companion could understand what he said. "But as your legs are long and strong, you may be able to find your way. It's true you're liable to starve to death, but if you do, it will be your own misfortune and not my fault." The Turk glared at him sullenly, but did not attempt to reply. Rob took out his box of tablets, ate one of them, and offered another to his enemy. The fellow accepted it ungraciously enough, but seeing Rob eat one, he decided to follow his example, and consumed the tablet with a queer expression of distrust upon his face. "Brave man!" cried Rob, laughingly. "You've avoided the pangs of starvation for a time, anyhow, so I can leave you with a clear conscience." Without more ado, he turned the indicator of the traveling machine and mounted into the air, leaving the Turk sitting upon the rocks and staring after him in comical bewilderment. End of chapter 14.